I'm David Cott, host of New History of Spain, and this is episode 28, titled The Kingdom of Asturias from Alfonso I to Vermudo. In this episode, I will explain the history of the stateless people of the Douro Basin and the political history of the Kingdom of Asturias from Alfonso I to Vermudo the Deacon, covering the years 739 to 791. Stateless societies, the Douro Basin. Before we dive into the Kingdom of Asturias, we need to talk about what will become its major area of expansion up to the 11th century, the entire Douro Basin, located in the northern part of the central plateau between the Cantabrian Mountains and the central system around Madrid. Contrary to what prominent historians like Claudio Sánchez Albornoz claimed decades ago, there was no such thing as a desert of the Duero or Douro River. In other words, it wasn't an uninhabited no man's land intentionally created by King Alfonso I of Asturias to act as a buffer zone against Muslim raids. According to this interpretation of the Asturian chronicles, Alfonso I supposedly expelled the Arab and Berber population and relocated the people of the Douro Basin to the Cantabrian Mountains. This mass migration would have given the fledgling Kingdom of Asturias a Gothic influx that transformed its political character. However, Ramón Menéndez Pidal already pointed out that in those times, to populate or repopulate didn't mean to colonize or create new settlements. It meant organizing a territory and integrating it into the administrative framework of a political entity under kings, counts, and the ecclesiastical hierarchy. This means that when primary sources talk about populating or repopulating León, Salamanca, or Porto, they don't imply that these places had disappeared or were ever deserted. What they are really saying is that these communities came under a larger political structure. This doesn't exclude the possibility that some migrants from the north arrived, and that new villages sprang up due to the slow agricultural and demographic expansion happening across Europe since the 9th century. The Asturian chronicles had a vested interest in erasing the fact that people already lived in the territories they claimed to have incorporated or conquered, in order to justify taking lands that weren't theirs. Similar phenomena happen in other parts of Europe, like England or the Carolingian Empire. So to avoid confusion, instead of repopulation, I prefer to talk about integration. The problem we face is that no written records from the early medieval Douro societies have survived, so these are people without history. All we have are Arabic and Latin chronicles, along with archaeology and place names, to help us understand the situation. We should picture the Douro Basin as a sparsely populated area even before the Islamic conquest. When the conquest happened, the Berbers settled in the region and likely formed alliances with the local aristocracy. However, after the large Berber revolt of the 740s, centralized political structures disappeared, and the church's administrative structure collapsed. The Douro Basin became a sort of no man's land, dotted with autonomous villages and local churches, without the emergence of a complex political entity of any size like we saw in Asturias or Navarre. Some historians believe self-managed peasant societies predominated, working the land communally, societies loosely resembling an anarchist ideal. And it's true that elites were the most negatively affected by the political collapse of the 8th century. But there was diversity. Some regions were dominated by elites who controlled fortified hill forts and villages, while the Roman cities, as basic units of territorial organization, all but disappeared. Elites weren't affected in the same way everywhere. Episcopal cities more closely tied to the Visigothic kingdom, like Braga or Astorga, were hit hardest. In contrast, elites in Galicia had a stronger local power basis, which is why, under the Astur-Leonese kingdom, we see prominent Galician figures able to rebel and reassert their authority. In some cases, the 8th century political collapse offered an opportunity for marginal elites to rise, such as in Zamora, which had been an insignificant settlement before the fall of the Visigothic kingdom, but became a key city in the north once it was incorporated into the Kingdom of Asturias. Overall, the Douro Basin's elites gradually regained prominence by specializing in warfare and forging alliances with Christians or Muslims to conduct raids and claim regional leadership over other local elites and free peasants. As a frontier region for most of the early Middle Ages, the Douro was more influenced by Al-Andalus than by the small and weak Kingdom of Asturias. After all, the Emirate of Córdoba was the hegemonic power of early medieval Iberia, and Berber presence persisted in the area. This led to the Arabization and Islamization of parts of the Douro population. For example, in Zamora, Islamic ceramics and coins have been found, and there is abundant Arabic place naming, while in Coimbra, the dominant elite was the Berber clan known as the Banu Danis. Nevertheless, the Kingdom of Asturias gradually expanded and incorporated these stateless societies, integrating them into its political and socio-economic system, sometimes by force, sometimes through diplomacy. In this process, the native elites of the Douro region validated and strengthened their social position, while the Christian kingdoms respected certain customs, codifying them in local charters known as fueros, for the newly integrated communities from the 11th century onwards. At the same time, the northern kings and counts gained new lands, more tribute, and additional manpower. Light and Darkness, Alfonso I of Asturias and his son Fruela. It's impossible for me to separate the territorial expansion of the reigns of Alfonso and Fruela of Asturias, because even the Asturian chronicles mix them up, attributing accomplishments to Alfonso I of Asturias that actually belong to his son Fruela. So let's look at how and why these reigns, spanning from 739 to 768, became entangled in Asturian history. Let's start with the basics. Who was the first Alfonso? Alfonso was the son of Peter of Cantabria, a supposed duke of the Visigothic kingdom who, according to one chronicle, was related to the most glorious kings of that kingdom, Leovigild and Recared. His name is not mentioned in contemporary Visigothic sources, so its prestigious lineage may have been a 9th century invention to establish continuity with the Visigothic kingdom and legitimize the ruling branch of Alfonso I and his brother Fruela, not to be confused with his son and future king of the same name. It's believed that Alfonso came to Asturias after Pelagius' revolt and married Ermesinda, the daughter of the Asturian leader. In this way, it's possible that two independent resistance centers may have merged, and Alfonso was able to claim the throne after the death of Pelagius' eldest son, Fabila, even though Fabila had male heirs. As I discussed in episode 25, Pelagius of Asturias and the Battle of Covadonga, the Chronicle of Alfonso III in its Ovetense version says Alfonso succeeded Fabila, while the Rotense version claims he was elected by the kingdom's nobles, emphasizing his legitimacy in line with the elective traditions of the Visigothic monarchy of Toledo. It's important to understand that during the period covered in this episode, it's probably more accurate to think of the Kingdom of Asturias as a chiefdom, a less complex political form than a state, where members of the same extended family monopolize fragile leadership power, rather than a true kingdom. It wasn't until Alfonso II of Asturias that the Asturian polity developed stronger institutions and centralized mechanisms of power. Only then was hereditary succession from father to son established as a general rule. All the Asturian chronicles portray Alfonso I as a victorious military leader and a devout Christian who built and restored numerous places of worship. His figure was so glorified by the chroniclers of the late 9th century that they even sanctified him and claimed that upon his death the songs of angels were heard over his palace. The main reason Alfonso I's reign stands out is because of his military campaigns, which more than true conquests were mostly raiding expeditions. These raids occurred after many Muslim garrisons had been abandoned due to the Berber revolt and civil war in Al-Andalus during the process of disintegration of the Umayyad Caliphate of Damascus. The Chronicle of Alfonso III gives detailed lists of cities that were attacked: Lugo, Tui, Porto, Braga, Viseu, Chaves, Ledesma, Salamanca, Zamora, Ávila, Astorga, León, Simancas, Saldaña, Amaya, Segovia, Osma, Sepúlveda, Clunia, and many other fortresses and villages. This chronicle is the most official and has the greatest interest in exaggerating the scope of Alfonso I's campaigns, even going so far as to claim he killed all the Arabs in these regions and relocated the Christians to the Cantabrian Mountains, leaving the Douro Basin depopulated. However, we know that many of the cities mentioned were not conquered and incorporated into the Kingdom of Asturias until more than a century later. The Chronicle of Albelda only mentions that he attacked León and Astorga and depopulated the region between the provinces of Palencia and Zamora. The Arabic Akhbar Maimua states that the Muslims of Kilikia, meaning the entire northwestern quadrant of the Iberian Peninsula, resisted for a time, but eventually those of wavering faith converted to Christianity, others died, and still others fled into the mountains or farther south, as far as Coria and Mérida in Extremadura. The Asturian chronicles themselves distinguish between cities that were merely raided and those that were truly incorporated into the Kingdom of Asturias. They claim that King Alfonso I expanded the small Asturian chiefdom, which originally included only central and eastern Asturias and the Cantabrian region of Liébana, until it covered all of Cantabria, the western part of the province of Biscay, northern Burgos, and the northern coast of Galicia. The chronicles contradict themselves when they say Álava, Biscay, and Pamplona were self-governed, but then mention rebellions in Álava during Fruela's reign. Calling them rebels implies they had first submitted to Asturian authority, just as happened in Al-Andalus with Emir Abdelrahman I. Most likely, this is just the official narrative used to justify Fruela's conquest of Álava and to expand the uncertain borders of the Vasconic territories under Asturian rule. The Asturian chronicles emphasize that Alfonso I carried out his campaigns with his brother, Fruela. And this association with those victories is no coincidence. His brother was the ancestor of Alfonso III, the reigning monarch when these chronicles were written. It is in the military campaigns of Alfonso and Fruela of Cantabria where the reigns of Alfonso I and his son Fruela became blended. Historian Julio Escalona convincingly argues that many of the famous campaigns credited to Alfonso I were actually carried out by Fruela I of Asturias, and that the chronicles of Alfonso III shifted those accomplishments back a generation to associate them with Alfonso and his brother Fruela of Cantabria. This was likely done to elevate the prestige of the ruling dynasty when the chronicles were written. We also have to consider that from the mid-740s to mid-750s, during most of Alfonso I's reign, the Iberian Peninsula was plagued by drought and famine, as confirmed by both Arabic sources and paleo-environmental studies. That makes it hard to believe he carried out large-scale campaigns during such a time of economic and social crisis. The Arabic chronicles had less motives to swap the achievements of one Asturian king for another, and they likely drew from earlier, less manipulated Asturian sources from the first half of the 9th century. That's why Arabic chroniclers differ from the rather negative view found in the surviving Latin chronicles regarding Fruela's reign. Instead, they portray him as someone who surpassed his father in determination, boldness, and ability to govern. They credit him with the conquest of Lugo and raids on Porto, Zamora, Salamanca, and Segovia. Given all this, it's worth taking Alfonso I down from the pedestal where he has traditionally been placed and restoring the memory of his son, King Fruela, as a monarch who continued his father's legacy and expanded the scope of Asturian conquests and raids. That brings me to the episode's secret question. Has anyone ever taken credit for your accomplishments? Tell me in the comments on YouTube or the podcast, and don't forget to subscribe to New History of Spain for more content. Before we wrap up the topic of Asturian incursions and territorial gains, it's worth paying attention to which villages and fortresses were attacked. David Peterson has pointed out a notable concentration of Asturian raids around La Rioja and Burgos, which could indicate an offensive against the early holdings of the Banu Qasi and other Muwallad families in the Upper Ebro region, meaning Hispanogoths who converted to Islam. This offensive may have largely broken Muslim control over this frontier area, which had once served the Visigothic kingdom in keeping the Vascons in check and in facilitating expansion and communication between Asturias and newly incorporated Álava. It's not surprising, given the proximity of strong Muslim holdings in the upper and middle Ebro, and the Castilian and Alabist territories of the Kingdom of Asturias, that most Muslim razzias, or raiding campaigns, during the Emirate of Córdoba targeted that region. To the west, Fruela brought the Galician lands up to the Miño River under his domain, and it appears the Asturians were now able to exercise sovereignty in Lugo. Several documents refer to Bishop Aurelius of Lugo, who arrived in Galicia with his family and servants after hearing of the Asturian monarchy's successes, seeking refuge from the violence and instability in North Africa, a crisis caused by the Great Berber Revolt and the Third Fitna. This unsettling territorial expansion by a distant Christian aristocrat, deemed a rebel from the Islamic point of view, prompted Emir Abdelrahman I to launch just a few years into his reign the expedition that will mark the first battle between the Emirate of Córdoba and the Kingdom of Asturias. The battle, known as Pontubio, took place somewhere in Galicia in 758 and ended in an Asturian victory and the beheading of the emir's second cousin. A compelling study by Carlos Baliñas compares how royal power consolidated in the peripheral areas of both the Kingdom of Asturias and the Anglo-Saxon Kingdom of Wessex. The Galicians did not easily accept Asturian authority, as they had an entrenched aristocracy with significant landholdings and a strong local influence that was unwilling to give up autonomy without benefits. But just as in England, where the external threat of Viking invasions facilitated the unification of the country under Wessex, in the 9th century, Muslim and Scandinavian raids led Galician elites to more readily accept Asturian sovereignty in exchange for the improved military protection political unity provided. Fruela's victory over the forces of Emir Abdelrahman I is an early example of the protector role by which Asturian monarchs legitimized their rule, protecting the social order of the time as illustrated by the suppression of a serf uprising under King Aurelius, or their patronage of churches and monasteries, helped the Asturian monarchy gradually win the loyalty of both secular and ecclesiastical Galician magnates. Reportedly, Fruela also took action against clerics who kept concubines and violated celibacy, though this may have been an invention of the chronicles to reinforce the king's role as defender of Christian orthodoxy. On another note, based on an inscribed tombstone found in Oviedo, some historians suggest that Bimara, Fruela's brother, built a residence for sailors and used the title of princeps, meaning ruler, which appears to support the idea that Bimara claimed the throne before being murdered by his own brother. These actions contribute to the chronicle's portrayal of Alfonso I's son as more authoritarian and cruel than his father. Also, during Fruela I's reign in 761, we find the earliest document referencing Oviedo and the founding of the monastery of San Vicente on a strategic hill that connected León, Lugo de Llanera, and Galicia through a network of roads. This event has traditionally been seen as the founding of Oviedo, and while it certainly laid the foundations for the Asturian royal city, archaeological evidence has confirmed the prior existence of numerous Roman-era villas in the area. Another document from 759, the earliest from what would become Castile, details the founding of a women's monastery in the small village of San Miguel de Pedroso, in the easternmost part of the province of Burgos. It was home to 28 nuns, many of them bearing Pyrenean and Basque names, and was founded in the presence of King Fruela and the Bishop of Oca. This document raises more questions than it answers, prompting us to wonder whether Asturian authority reached the Muslim frontier in La Rioja for a brief period, or whether we should regard this territory as within the Asturian sphere of influence without being fully integrated. Otherwise, it's hard to explain why much of northern Burgos was not yet part of the Kingdom of Asturias. Fruela succeeded in subduing the Vascons of Álava and Biscay and married a local woman named Munia, who was reportedly captured and enslaved by Asturians as part of the war spoils, and Fruela likely chose to marry her for personal rather than political reasons. In Gascony, in the French southwest, Duke Wafer of Aquitaine fought for independence from the Carolingian king Pepin the Short. The same year Wafer was defeated and killed by his own men, King Fruela was assassinated in Cangas de Onís. Without sources to directly link the events, historian Alberto González García speculates that the campaign of 767 in Álava, led by the freedman Badr on behalf of the Emirate of Córdoba, and the final Frankish campaign against the Aquitanians might be connected. As we saw in episode 27, Abdelrahman I, the refugee who seized Al-Andalus, the first Emir of Córdoba had a tumultuous reign and had to fight constantly to secure his authority in Al-Andalus. So why the urgency for the 767 campaign? Given that no further razzias occurred until the late 8th century, when Alfonso II of Asturias approached the Carolingian Empire, it's possible the goal by the Umayyads in 767 was to sever land and sea routes and destroy Asturian-held ports along the Vasconic coast. This could suggest that King Fruela I of Asturias had allied with Duke Wafer of Aquitaine. An idea made more plausible when we consider that Alfonso II later sent a diplomatic mission to the court of Louis the Pious, King of Aquitaine and Charlemagne's successor, saying it was to renew his ancestors' pacts, though we have no record of any prior agreement. Fruela's brother's claim to the throne might also have been tied to the rise of a faction opposed to Fruela's geopolitical strategy. If so, the fates of Fruela and Wafer were tragically intertwined. The obscure reigns of Aurelius and Silo. Fruela's cousin, Aurelius, succeeded him on the throne following Fruela's assassination in 768. From Aurelius to Vermudo I, Spanish nationalist historians, following the narrative of the Reconquista, labeled these kings as lazy for maintaining peace with the Muslims and failing to launch new conquests. In reality, both the small Kingdom of Asturias and the Emirate of Córdoba were grappling with internal issues that left little room for offensives or expansion. It's important to note that the Asturian chronicles are extremely brief when it comes to the reigns of Aurelius, Silo, Mauregatus, and Vermudo, so we can truly speak of a dark period in which we know very little about what was happening politically, economically, or socially in the Asturian kingdom. Aurelius did not rule from Cangas de Onís but from San Martín del Rey Aurelio, just as Silo would later rule from Pravia, reflecting that no permanent royal seat had yet been established. That wouldn't change until Alfonso II built Oviedo, as a kind of small replica of Toledo to showcase Asturian royal power. One of the few things we know about Aurelius's reign is that a serf revolt took place, which might have been significant given that it was mentioned in the chronicles. There has been much debate about slavery and servitude in the Kingdom of Asturias, but land-bound serfs serving a lord were far more common than chattel slaves. After 6 years of rule, Aurelius died, and in 774 Silo succeeded him. Silo came to power through his marriage to Adosinda, granddaughter of Pelagius and daughter of Alfonso I. Some chronicles refer to this as a dynastic succession since he was considered part of the royal family by marriage. Much speculation has arisen from a passage in the Chronicle of Albelda which states that Silo maintained peace with the Emirate of Córdoba because of his mother. But the most likely interpretation is that his mother had been handed over as a hostage to Córdoba to ensure peace, not that she was a Muslim or a concubine to the Emir. The most significant event of Silo's reign was a new rebellion in Galicia, which led to the Battle of Montecubeiro in Castro Verde, near Lugo. In that battle, opponents of the Asturian monarchy were defeated. King Silo and Queen Adosinda founded the Church of Santianes de Pravia, one of the most representative churches of Asturian pre-Romanesque architecture, which also served as the royal chapel for the monarchs of Asturias. Nearby, they built the royal residence in Pravia, which later served as a temporary residence for other kings such as Vermudo II and Alfonso V of León. As Silo and Adosinda appear to have had no children, they chose their nephew, Alfonso, to serve as palace steward and prepare him for kingship. Silo died in 783 and the religious complex in Pravia was converted into a monastery. 2 years later, the widowed queen Adosinda took religious vows, either as a way to protect herself from potential retaliation by Mauregatus or under pressure from him because she had supported her nephew Alfonso's claim to the throne. Adocinda confirmed her spiritual retreat in the presence of an abbot and the monk Beatus of Liébana. In doing so, she also complied with the Gothic-era councils of Toledo, which set expectations for widowed queens, and reinforced her image as a pious woman. Storm Wines, Mauregatus and Vermudo the Deacon. Why didn't Alfonso II become king as expected in 783? Because Mauregatus, a son of Alfonso I, garnered enough support from the Asturian nobility to carry out a coup d'etat. Alfonso II was forced to flee and seek refuge in Álava, his mother Munia's homeland. That's all the brief Asturian chronicles say about Mauregatus. But the event itself reveals the monarchy's weak control over its peripheral territories. Mauregatus' legitimacy was further undermined by the emphasis placed on his mother's servile origin. In fact, based on his name, some have even suggested she may have been a Berber Muslim. At the same time, efforts were made to obscure the fact that Alfonso II's mother had been a war captive who later became queen. A true black legend hangs over Mauregatus for his illegitimate and violent rise to power. In fact, by the 13th century, the legend of the tribute of the 100 Maidens emerged. It claimed that some Asturian kings, starting with Mauregatus, had purchased peace from the emirs of Córdoba by delivering 100 virgin maidens each year to be added to Islamic harems or sold into slavery. This is nothing more than a much later invention, but the legend plays a role in the Reconquista discourse, symbolizing a humiliation of Christians and another grievance used to justify the Christian conquest of Al-Andalus. In 789, Mauregatus died, and despite being a clergyman, Vermudo, son of Fruela of Cantabria and brother of the late king Aurelius, succeeded him. Once again, Alfonso II's dynastic rights were overlooked, revealing that he still lacked support at that point, and perhaps the ruling faction feared retaliation for the murder of his father, Fruela. As a fun fact, King Felipe VI of Spain can trace his royal lineage in Spain back to Vermudo the Deacon. Hisham I, the successor of Abdelrahman I and a devout Muslim, resumed punitive campaigns against the Kingdom of Asturias. It's worth remembering that in the Islamic worldview, the entire Iberian Peninsula belonged by right of conquest to the Muslims. The emergence of a Christian power within its borders was intolerable. Hisham sent a dual military raid against both flanks of the Asturian kingdom, Álava and Galicia. Both attacks were successful. In Burbia, near the present-day town of Villafranca del Bierzo, in León, King Vermudo the Deacon faced the Muslim forces and suffered such a crushing defeat that it likely triggered his abdication and return to religious life, paving the way, at last, for Alfonso II to take the throne. Winds of change were blowing. From Córdoba and the frontier regions of Al-Andalus, there will be no more passive tolerance of a growing Christian power in the north. Beatus of Liébana, the intellectual of the Kingdom of Asturias. The Asturionese kingdom didn't produce a great body of literature or culture, but there was one intellectual who undoubtedly stood out, not only in the Iberian Peninsula, but across all of Europe, the monk Beatus of Liébana. Beatus of Liébana is practically synonymous with the culture of the Kingdom of Asturias, yet we know very little about his origins and life, as is the case with so many figures from early medieval Europe. Some have speculated that he was a native to the Cantabrian county of Liébana, but came from the Muslim-controlled south. But these are just that, baseless speculations. I will leave the hugely important adoptionist controversy for the next episode, since it's a theological conflict with ramifications for the Emirate of Córdoba, the Kingdom of Asturias, and the Carolingian Empire. However, as early as 776, Beatus of Liébana began writing his most influential work, and he completed the third and most widely copied version in 786, after the adoptionist controversy had broken out. I'm talking about his commentary on the Apocalypse, a work that circulated throughout Christian Europe during the Middle Ages and exists in numerous versions with beautiful illustrations, the famous Beatus manuscripts. Art historians have pointed to the profound influence of these illuminations on medieval Christian miniature art, particularly Romanesque art, with its colorful, abstract, and non-dimensional style. Beatus captivated his audience with a plain-spoken and polemical style, combined with innovative illustrations. And in doing so, he achieved the power and relevance he sought. The monk from the monastery of Santo Toribio de Liébana had studied the interpretations of other Christian authors on the book of Revelation, and he believed that the signs of his own time indicated that the end of the world and the second coming of Christ were imminent. This obsession with figuring out when the world will collapse and the final judgment will begin is a recurring theme in human history. Just think of the 2012 Doomsday Scare based on a Mayan prophecy. In a letter from Bishop Elipandus of Toledo to the bishops of Gaul in 794, he jokingly recounts that on an Easter Sunday, Beatus of Liébana proclaimed that the final judgment will happen that very night and urged people to abstain from eating as an act of penance. However, as the day passed without incident, another priest supposedly shouted that everyone should eat and drink, and that if they were going to die, they might as well do it with full stomachs. We can't know for sure whether this really happened or if this was simply a slander by the Bishop of Toledo, but it wouldn't be surprising. Beatus genuinely believed the apocalypse will occur in his lifetime. It's important to understand that centuries earlier, figures like Jerome of Stridon and Julian of Toledo had calculated that the end of the world will come in the year 800 or 801, based on the belief that the 6th millennium since creation will mark the world's end, and that Christ had been born around the year 5200 after creation. As a man of faith, Beatus wrote his commentary on the apocalypse to fulfill a moral and religious duty, to warn and prepare Christians for what he believed was an imminent future. We don't know if Beatus lived long enough to see that the world didn't end at the dawn of the 9th century, but Christian thinkers continued to revise their millenarian predictions throughout the Middle Ages. In the 8th century, Islam was still seen by many Christian clergy as a Christian heresy that the Catholic Church will eventually eliminate. Because of this, Beatus did not consider Islam the embodiment of the Antichrist. However, his commentary on the apocalypse became far more widely read and copied between the 10th and 13th centuries, in the context of the rise of crusading ideology and the growing antagonism between Christianity and Islam. Readers and scribes of his work during that period, especially in the Iberian Peninsula, did believe that Muhammad and Islam represented the Antichrist, and that only by eliminating this religion will the 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth begin. Beatus of Liébana is also credited with composing the Ode Verbum, a liturgical hymn dedicated to the Apostle James the Great as the evangelizer of Hispania and protector of the king, clergy, and people. The earliest text that mentions James the Great preaching in Iberia is the Breviary of the Apostles, written in the 6th century. Little by little, this idea spread throughout Hispania until, during the reign of Alfonso II, the supposed tomb of the apostle was discovered in Santiago de Compostela. Given Beatus's influence among the intellectual elite of northern Iberia, it's not hard to believe that his faith in James' evangelizing mission and his Ode Verbum hymn played a key role in the emergence of the devotion of St. James, a devotion of great political and ideological significance for the Kingdom of Asturias and its projection across Europe.
The verdict.
In today's verdict, I want to highlight the value of analyzing sources critically and using interdisciplinary history to give a voice to the underrepresented and silenced, such as the societies of the Douro River region in the early Middle Ages. Medieval historians have at times taken the chronicles too literally and uncritically, failing to consider why the chroniclers wrote what they did, or to question their perspectives. That's a huge problem. Just imagine if the historians of the year 2500 only considered government documents or political pamphlets. How distorted will their understanding of our present reality be? What's more, Sánchez Albornoz made a serious misstep with his Desert of the Douro thesis, not only because he accepted most of what the chronicles said as fact, but also due to a philological error, not understanding that in that era, to populate meant to organize and integrate into administrative frameworks. Archaeology has thoroughly debunked the idea of a depopulated Douro region, showing that there were indeed populations north and south of the river, even though many sites still remain to be excavated and analyzed. That's why an interdisciplinary approach to history is so essential. Other fields such as philology, toponymy, archaeology, and sociology help us better understand history, filling the gaps left by written sources and sometimes even contradict them. And with that, the verdict ends. Before you go, I want to give a big thank you to all my beloved Patreons on Patreon and Apple Podcasts who help keep this project going. You can support it too at patreon.com/newhistoryspain and get early access to all my content and exclusive merch. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube and share the episodes with other history lovers. In the next episode, I will talk about the Carolingian Empire and its first campaigns in Spanish lands. Thank you for your attention and see you soon!